Objects that live. Thank you so much. That was a super interesting set of papers, which covered such a wide gamut of different topics. I've been trying to figure out how to think about, I mean, they were just so provocative in many ways. But perhaps we should just be, partly also just because we've just heard this incredible performance act. One of the things that was striking to me is about violence. And not only that our heritage is made up of a history of violence, but our heritage is violence. You've proposed, Bonaventure, different ways of that we can actually deal with that, this idea of performance as a different discursive form that can actually then deal with this and actually confront our violence. I was wondering if the other speakers, coming from their own background, what they think about how we can actually reckon with that violence of our past and keep that as something which is alive rather than something which can, in many ways, that history can in some ways try to ease or at least appease that sense of violent act itself. Do you want to?
No, I don't know. I think it is very accurate to say that behind the very notion of heritage, there lies the question of history and of violence, and the idea that, I mean, in French the word is patrimoine. It's coming from the Latin patrimonium, so, and it's the same thing as heritage, in fact. It does mean the same thing, which is the idea that we receive something from someone and that it belongs to us. And as soon as you're speaking of belonging, you're speaking about violence. And so my main problem is why, at one point, do we, I mean, when do we stop, in a way, considering that one violence is legitimate and the other one is not? And the questions I was trying to raise are these ones, in the sense that there's, it's really difficult to resist what I would call the intimation of good intentions, in a way. So our desire to say that violence was such that it needs some kind of reparation, and I do believe in that, in order for any society to work, has to stop somewhere. And the main problem and I think that the main issue we're confronting now, that we open the subject completely, I mean, it was closed for a very long time. In Europe, basically, after the Napoleonic Wars, it was decided to close the subject in 1825 and to decide that some works were going to be repatriated in various countries, and that would be the end of the discussions. So that was for Europe, and I'm not saying that Europe was less violent at what point towards itself. And that's one of the things I need to point out, is that, of course, there's a specific colonial violence that has to be addressed, but it is not as if violence was not exerted by Europe against itself.
Right.
No, I'm not saying that it doesn't mean that the colonial thing is not something different.
I think it's a perversion to start comparing violences.
No, I'm not starting comparing violences. I'm just saying...
What is the point?
The question we need to raise is, when do we start and when do we stop? And where do we decide that something needs some reparation now, and when do we start thinking that there's no need for such reparation because it's too old, or because it's too much of an insider thing, or something like that. And then immediately, if I say something like that, I am under the tyranny of good intention.
No, it's not about your good intention. It's just about
no, it's not about my good intention,
or the falsity of what you say. You know, I think we can start we might stop talking about the violence when the things are taken care of, when we've engaged in an understanding of how certain things came here, so a proper provenance research is made, and when the people from whom are the people demanding some of these things are taken seriously. You know, and I think that is when we can think of stopping to talk about the violence. The violence is real, it is current, and one has to deal with them. And I think that, again, coming back to the point, I'm not in the business of comparing violences. Euro's violence to itself was more than the other. I don't care about that. I am thinking about the violence that is enacted towards a people, which is my people in this case. And I don't want to, whenever you point out the violence towards yourself, people come and tell other people also receiving violence. I want to talk about mine without having to justify that. And the point is that the violence is real, it's been exerted, and you go to some of these institutions, like in Berlin, and you see the throne of Sultan Joya, which is here, and there is a real, impact on the people of Bamum that have been asking for that for years. And this is reality. So I cannot stop talking about violence when it is real and the people are feeling this violence exerted on them.
I'm not saying you're wrong about that. What I'm saying is that by using words such as people, my people, origin, and all these things, then you enter a discourse which is really problematic. And I think that it is problematic any way we put it, because then it can be generalized, and I don't believe in this kind of generalization, but I don't want to monopolize. And I think that,
if they're called on that, the French actually won.
Well, Pablo, you had the point. You want to jump into this?
I was just, maybe, I don't know, I think that is quite a broad question, like to talk about violence. In the case of Guatemala, was a country that lived 36 years of internal civil war. So I grew up in the 80s, and the peace accords were signed in 1996. So I grew up in the middle of the civil war, and my parents were involved directly. So I guess that a lot of us knows about violence in different ways. But also, if we look into contemporary politics, all the model of politics is based on necropolitics in a way, right? So I guess that we could kind of classify different models or ways of violence. But thinking beyond that, I think that coloniality is actually a very violent act, and it happened in very different ways. We were just talking with Boventure about El Pueblo Garifuna, the Garifuna people. So it was this ship that came from what we know now as Nigeria, and then it naufragated near San Vicente and Granadinas, so they were being traded as slaves. And then they encounter indigenous population in the Caribbean. And the indigenous population in the Caribbean enslaved the people that naufragated, right? And then there was this whole history of exile that went to Jamaica, Honduras, and Guatemala, for instance. So what I'm trying to say is that it's quite a broad topic to talk about violence. So I don't know exactly where I should start.
I think it's more to thinking about to recognize our own violence, right? Our own heritage of violence. It's not really just a case of whose violence or who's legitimizing goes. In some ways, it's almost a responsibility that we have in our own way, that we have to recognize our own history of violence that we inflict as well. And that's kind of where I'm coming at. To what degree do we actually do that? I mean, we certainly don't necessarily do that on a regular basis, but there seems to be a greater urgency for us right at this moment in time for us to really think about the kind of violence that we inflict ourselves, that violence is part of our history. It isn't somebody else's history that's been done, it's our history.
I'd like to come at this from another perspective, and it's the framing of discourse that I should actually like to look at. A lot of, even here in this conference, it's Manichaean dyads. It's great Judeo-Christian Islamic dyadic framings of West versus something else, or me versus something else, or the the cultural production of peoples who are not invested in Western art are generally stereotyped as communal, as less individualistic. I think there's a violence in this binary itself.
I agree.
And it produces violence. And a lot of my work has been an inquiry into how discourse, when strident, produces and reproduces violence. Now, I'd like to add to what you said, Pablo, which is not only the personal experience, as you have, and many here, but the lineages of violence, how it moves and transfers from one point to another. I remember a long time ago, I was so surprised. Where was I? It was the Adelaide Arts Festival. And there was a play from a Japanese director, whom I forget, and it was about the extreme and extraordinary violence that was experienced in Japan in little places that was transferred during the Japanese occupation of Southeast Asia, directly from those villages to the infliction of violence to villages in the Philippines and other parts of Southeast Asia. I'm actually more interested in the lineages of where it came from. I was surprised because I grew up with my parents and grandparents talking about the enormous violence of the Japanese occupation. But to know that it came from some place.
Right. So the origins.
The origin and how it
Traveled.
How it traveled, the cartography of this.
Well, that's also very interesting in that then it takes it out of geographies, right? Because you're
It
moving
moves from
around,
one
it
place
moves
to
around.
another.
It is kind of what you were saying in
And
terms of
generationally.
displacement.
And generationally.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that was something that you had brought up in yours, Pablo, in your talk as well, when you were talking about, in many ways, you're almost proposing for the existence of multiple worlds, right? And thinking about this as a different kind of framework of thinking about these things. And I was wondering how these, and maybe, and correct me if I'm wrong, that you're talking about the existence of these possibility of these multiple worlds where differences can actually be, and that it's just a case of how we entangle or disentangle ourselves, right? Is that kind of what you were talking about when you were talking about your plurilingualism, but also this idea of subjectivity that comes from multiple different things, and it's not necessarily just of a person itself?
Yeah, I think that it's, I'm trying to think more on connections than specificities, cultural specifics now. I think that, and that's what I call cosmoplanetarisms, like this kind of entangled world. But going a little bit back to what you were saying before, there is this kind of, maybe a bit rough of a division that Bifo Berardi does with politics in the world now, and forces, like, in a way. So he talks about neoliberalism as violent, as a violent regime. He talks about ultra-right-wing politics as the other one. That is this kind of going back to nationalisms and so on. And then the third one is necropolitics. So the narco power in Mexico, Guatemala, Central America, but also in Middle East. So I have the feeling that there is something, of course, so where is the rest? And all of the rest, I think that is composed by all of us, in a way, right? So how to think beyond violence and beyond violent regimes of power, of language and translation and so on. And I think that there is something happening in there. I would also argue that contemporary art is part of that kind of concert that is not part of these violent forces that I just mentioned before. So yeah, but if that happens, how we can connect between Africa, Latin America, Asia, Europe, in a kind of an entangled, productive way? That would be the question, right?
Well, that was where I was going to go next. Do you see these entangled histories being from Asia, from Africa, and all those things, places? Do you see those? How do you see those entanglement happening?
I guess that in many different ways. I was mentioning like briefly this difference between post-communist regions and post-colonial regions. There are different timelines, so the challenge is how to think on those different timelines and do these connections. But if you look into history, again, we find a lot of connections, like with Garífunas, right? For instance, this that in Guatemala, the only Afro-descendants people that we have are Garífunas, and it is a very small community in Livingstone, but that's connection, and that's planetary connection in a way, and that's a way of planetary consciousness, that it has been happening there all the time, right? Like, another thing is like how you connect to that and how you read it, but it is there, so.
I will say something about the entanglements in a bit, but I wanted to come back to what violence facilitates. In the context of Cameroon, for example, where we've had a president for the past 36 years, a person who has ruled the country with an iron hand, to say the least. As I was trying to say, culture and heritage plays a very little role to him, at least, in the sense of, so if some people would come and say, this figure, this being that is in this museum somewhere is of importance to us, he wouldn't really care much. He would prefer to sign a contract with France or with Germany and so on business terms, and just leave the thing there. That is an incredible violence, you know, that is being perpetuated because of a man who's a dictator in power and doesn't care about the needs of the people, you know. So that is, to me, the continuity I see, you know, and what it enables, you know, and where does culture then find its place within this kind of spaces, you know. Okay. With regards to entanglement, I think the Garifuna idea is one of many, you know, but we've been, you know, we're working on a project on the Indian Ocean, you know, thinking of, you know, what some people have called one of the oldest continuums of humanity, you know, the communication between the East African coast and Asia, you know, before Vasco da Gama ever set foot there. People were communicating, intermarrying, especially within spaces of the sonic do we find these connections, these entanglements, you know. So in a lot of my practice, you know, the Garifuna becomes an important example because you see the way these sounds come together and are expressed within those, you know. And there are many other examples.
Right, you're talking about linguistic similarities.
Linguistic similarities, but also in the sound of like the music that people play,
yeah, right,
in the beings of the people, the mixing of peoples and so on and so forth. So there are many, and then to push it further, the entanglements of histories, as in who has the responsibility over what happened, you know. So it is the responsibility of the people that suffered something and the perpetrator to deal with that together, you know. So that is another entanglement I would like to see, and which is something important in my practice.
Do you want to add to that?
I actually had something else to add, just one sentence. I really have a problem with Reconstruct the West, because right this very minute, my problem is China. So my mind's not in the West right now. I really have very serious problems that I am dealing with right now with regard to the occupation of islands off the coast of the Philippines. So just to get that, just to set that aside. And I'm not being specious. I really think that we have to be, the obligation right now at this point in history, I think, is to be far more nuanced than we ever were at any other time in human history, I think.
Well, yeah, certainly the rise of China. I mean, China's been accused of being, or have been said, described to be a neo-colonial, right? In terms of the way that they have been using the resources, the way that they have been using money to redraw boundaries themselves in these particular islands. And that's definitely have changed how we think about not just the West, but but Asia itself, I think, is also something that's also coming.
Just a riposte. I think we should have thought about this a long time ago, before we started dividing the world into East versus West. Because certainly a place like the Philippines does not belong to either. We're a Pacific island nation. And we have far more similar to Tonga than we have to Asia, actually.
Yeah, this is the cartography, right? The
Exactly.
violent type.
Can I just say something? With regards to this, you know, I was once in Kenya and having a conversation with somebody critiquing the, you know, the space the Chinese are taking in Kenya. And they looked at me and basically said, what are you talking about?
Yeah, that's...
So the concern, their concern is not China. Their concern is working with China. China is not a problem with them. So I think we also have to, when we're talking about being nuanced, we also have to talk from what specific space are we talking about, you know. So if I'm speaking from the space of Cameroon, China is not necessarily my problem.
Right.
So we have to be very careful about that. Secondly, the concept of the West and the non-West, whether we like it or not, from the Treaty of Tordesillas, with the partitioning of the world, the Portuguese this part, the Spanish this part, we create a demarcation of West and non-West. When we talk about West and non-West, we're not talking about some fictional things, we're talking about the structures, the judicial structures, the maritime laws that were set in that period that still function and are still of importance today. So I think that discarding concepts of the West and the non-West, just like this, whether we like it or not, it's a bit, to my opinion, moving too fast, while these structures are still there. Yeah, the maritime routes are still similar routes that are being used. The ports and the laws are still similar ones. You know, and the control of territory is, so I would also pledge there for more nuanceness and actually ask where the West comes from and the notion of the non-West comes from to this before we discard it.
If we have no more to add to that, perhaps I can also open the floor. I do know there's a lot of questions as well, so question time. There's one at the back.
No, just two clarifications before I have questions. I would find it really useful, just two clarifications, I'll be really quick. Marianne, you said something, hi. You said in the last part of your talk something I would just like repeating because it was like kind of mind-blowing. This this return of weapons and the weaponized, and to understand how contemporary weapons exist. Can you just repeat that, please, one time? For my jouissance.
For your jouissance, which brings us to the edge of something else. It's not pleasure. And it's not going to be pleasurable. It's the idea of recuperating something, and the nickname for it is weaponry. The metaphor, the generalization would be weaponry. To get a sense of the weaponization that we are faced every day, and it's plural now, because the complexity of that, from what we can see, might be helpful in looking at the complexity right now.
Definitely, I totally agree. And Manuel de Landa, who writes that no weapon ever went out of fashion, right? We still use every weapon that was available. So seeing those weapons, right, in Western Museum that are actually encased, maybe can exactly mean something in that sense. And the other clarification I had for you, my friend, what exactly is your problem with the Louvre Abu Dhabi? Can you just like clarify that?
What?
For the Louvre Abu Dhabi.
Problem with the Louvre Abu Dhabi?
Yeah.
It's difficult. I said that I'm pretty much, I mean, the first problem is its location. let's say. But the problem was that...
without any like sniggering, without any like assumptions, just tell me what's wrong with the location.
What's wrong with the location? What's wrong with the location is the fact that it's in a country which, I mean, it is there only because this country has a lot of money, and for no other reason. So, second problem...
Couldn't we say the same of Louvre, France?
I would say that...
There's a lot of money.
No. There's a lot of money, but it's part of history. And one of my problem is how do we deal with history in terms of not erasing it, but at a moment using it to invent some kind of a future. And I do think that it would have been, I mean, I would have preferred in itself that France work with other countries than Abu Dhabi first. So that's my main problem, I would say.
But again, like let's expand. I just want to understand. Yeah.
Expand what?
No, because I feel like we're using some assumptions, we're not saying things.
No. I am saying things. I am saying things very clearly.
Is it just? I just want to check with you. Is it about oil? Because then France could have worked with Norway, and that would still be a problem. So just to check.
France is working with Norway.
I do
think that it was
branch
important.
of
I do think that it was important that it was in that it was a project that was made between France and an ex-colony, not of France in this case, but of another country. And I do think that it would have been more interesting to work with an ex-French colony because the link would have been more direct. Second point with which I have some problems is the way then it meant that this co-construction could not function completely because there was the assumption was that knowledge was in France and money was in Abu Dhabi. And I do not think that it's a good way to collaborate. I do think that it's more interesting when the assumption is that knowledge is on both sides, so that the museum is constructed from that sharing of different knowledges and not on that idea of bringing one knowledge to another part of the world. Now so this is sort of a starting point. Now the way I see Abu Dhabi in itself when visiting it is that it works in a different way from that assumption, and that there was, at least in the initial display, there was some efforts in some parts of the museum, not everywhere, but for instance, in the room I reproduced, or in the two rooms I reproduced, to work in a much more collaborative way, which would be to place together works of art from different parts of the world without erasing the violence that is between them sometimes, the violence that is ingrained into them sometimes. Erasing their provenance, for me, is a real problem in general, and that's why I mean, it's one of the first programs I started when I took home, I became director of Yenesha, was to work on this provenance of African objects in French museum. But apart from that, I do think that it is something that, if taken seriously, changes the way we look at museums. If we do still, I understand that you can think that a museum is not a good thing, but I do think that it is a good thing because it's a place, maybe, and I'm using the word voluntarily, to neutralize some things, which is to say that they are objects of study first, and that through being objects of study, which means sharing some knowledge and confronting some positions and building something from this confrontation, then we can gain something. I don't know whether it's completely the case. Have you been to the museum or not?
Yeah, I've been, yeah. I quite liked it.
But I think it's working because there are important works. Otherwise, it's not working. When you only have replicas or things of secondary value, which is one of my fears with the repatriations movement, is that European countries might just tend to give back only what they deem less important, which could very easily happen. But that doesn't. But that's not real world. Unfortunately, it's not the real world. If someone goes to you and say, "Please give me back, give me something," just because I want it, it doesn't work. And if you say, "Please give it back to me because it belongs to me," then you have to prove that it belongs to you, which is something complicated because with artworks in general, and again, that's why I took these examples. If you look at the way a lot of French churches, for instance, were complaining about the fact that the Louvre were taking their objects, then I know it's not the same context. I know it's not the same situation. But if we live in a rational world, then it means that any demand can be enlarged and generalized. And we've seen today that it is the case that, for instance, it's not only Africa which has been deprived of its heritage. So
Let's move on. There was a question over there at the back, please.
I'm not sure my questions make sense, but I try. So most of the paper today deals with the notions of we and otherness within the context of colonization. But how about the notions of the notion of otherness or violence within the same nation state, like physically within? Not in the notion of colonization, but within the same nation state, within the same country.
So the insider in the outsider in the inside is
they are practically insider, but maybe they are like racially different or ethnically different, but they are the same citizens within the country. What about that kind of otherness and violence within the same boundary?
Okay, I think that I can answer maybe a little bit with an example. On one hand, well, nation states keeps in so many ways organizing the world, right? Like institutions and so on. But on the other, if you want to think, I feel, critically some things, nation states are not longer that useful. I'm talking about thinking, right? But going back to this idea of the nation state and population, in 2004, there was this huge Chicano and Latin American immigrants manifestation in the United States. So at some point, they started to sing the U.S. national anthem, but they did it in Spanish. So it was exactly the same anthem, but translated, right? So a few days after that, Bush, the Biden, Bush Jr., he stated in a press conference that the U.S. anthem was only to be sung in English, right? So he said that officially. So the question is why? What is happening there, right? Why you cannot sing the same national anthem in a language that is not English, right? Especially when you're talking, in this case, about the biggest minority in the US, right? So I say that just to answer to this question of nationalisms. Like, it's still very difficult, even when you think from within countries, right? So the problem was symbolic. And that's, again, the problem with the West and all the allocation, in a way, on where and how to allocate the West. It is also a problem of the symbolic order, and it is a problem of language. And I guess that this example kind of exemplifies, in a way, this.
Miriam, I think
I would like to, first of all, endorse your what seems to me to be a position you're inching towards, which I believe is a matter of inflection, to shift the inflection of discussion and debate from the anti-colonial struggle to the neo-colonial struggle with the nation states. I would certainly endorse a little bit more of that to inflect our energies and what we're trying to do, resistances, without at any point yielding the idea that the colonial paradigms are operating everywhere. I think what we need to appreciate right now is the imbricatedness of the colonial with the neocolonial, and that they're operating simultaneously, but also disjunctively. And that's what makes the situations today far more complicated than just simply the anti-colonial struggles that were waged by our grandparents. Right now, the neocolonial is quite vicious.
So, if I may add to that, immediately after independence of Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah wrote a paper on neocolonialism, where he said, we've gained territory and we've lost every other thing. So we have a semblance of sovereignty, but we are still being controlled by any other person. Now, that I find interesting, because he points at this continuum, this kind of a beast that takes another form. And what I find interesting about the Latin American thinkers, that are writing on coloniality and decoloniality, Quijano and Mignola and a couple of others, is the way they see this continuum. And I would like to exemplify with the case of Cameroon. We are in a state of war right now. A war between Anglophones and Francophones. Okay, so within that fiction called a nation state, and I tell you, the nation state has failed us completely. Within that fiction called the nation state, some people have chosen to other each other by making the other the Anglophone or the Francophone. Categories that have been imposed on us by the colonial enterprise, right? So we are in a state of war right now. So the internal othering is there. And I tell you, it's not even like a metaphor. It's physical. If you take the car from Yaoundé, the capital of the country, and you're driving over to Bamenda, where the Francophone part ends, the road stops. The tarred road stops. The Anglophone part of the country, there's no tar. So it's real, And of course, we can dig deeper in that, but there are these things. Of course, we can talk about also the kind of othering that is done through the notion of tribes. So the concept of tribalism, especially in contexts where a lot of tribes were also created by the colonial enterprise. Fictions. You have power, we divide the power in you, and then you have hundreds of tribes, and then people suffer. So you have this. I'm not saying that all the differences of tribes are all based on the colonialism, but one has to acknowledge that. Now the question, that one has to go back now to look at someone like Glissant when he talks about, difference in relation. And he gives the example of the African continent. We've always been different, but it is through the many differences that we make relations. So how do we understand relations as, not because of, we need to create sameness to be in relation, but thanks to our differences, So we need to reinvent that living together. And the nation state, I am sorry to say, is not the model that would help us out there, especially not in Cameroon.
Any other questions? I think one of the things that you picked up is also something, we've seen it here in Hong Kong too, this idea of differences in language and the othering of ourselves and what is happening in Hong Kong and especially more recently because of all the censorship issues that have also been raised as a result of this. It's just where do we now position ourselves between the Cantonese speaking and the Mandarin speaking. And in some ways there is a fear, especially of a disappearing of the Cantonese language itself, because it's actually not being taught in the same way that it had been before, and that's where the institutions really come and play in terms of how they're actually structuring these powers as well. And that's always been, there's other ways, and it's very complicated because it's also about, there is this connection of bloodline they're also at the same time identified with one another because they're both Chinese, but that there is this difference in terms of their heritage, but also in terms of the way that they understand the heritage through language as well, which is also interesting. Yes.
I'd like to speak to that. Of course, language is always charged with class and other nasty things. But if we set that aside for a bit and think about the possibilities in language itself, as you have tried, I think, to point out, there's curatorial possibilities, but I'd like to actually get a little bit closer to political possibilities. Language, for example, one language in the Philippines, was actually the source of a bit of theorizing that an academic friend of mine was engaged in. And it is about the notion of ownership, not as owning something, but as a medium through time. That you don't actually inherit your house from your grandmother or your grandfather, but it is passing through you, through your grandchildren. And your responsibility is to take care of it, right. Not for proprietary reasons, but as a conduit to another generation.
So
now, it's not inheritance at all. The concept does not occur in the language. So property does not actually occur in the language. What occurs is custodianship, and how you move something, an object, a house, a piece of air, and it goes through you. Now, this can go into a spiral, into some kind of romantic, noble savage kind of discourse, which we are always going to have to be careful about. But there is possibility in theorizing out of language, out of some of the quandaries that we are facing, with the caveat that we are quite rigorous about this.
And I was just thinking through that when, on the other hand, there is these hierarchies of languages, right? So there are some languages that matters more than others. In the case, well, the Mayan languages were reconstructed through this kind of fictional grammar called Proto-Maya, right? But then you have also this relation between Mayan languages and social classes. The mestizos, we just speak Spanish because we learn it that way. But I have memories of my grandma speaking Quiché with her friend at her hometown, for instance, but she never taught to me, right? She was like, yeah, you don't need that in a way. So that's one thing. But the other is that when we think through the specificities of very local native languages, it can be not productive in that way, because, like if you think about decolonial theory, there is this kind of thing where you are all the time kind of inventing words. So you're like, okay, death doesn't exist in our culture because, we have another word for that, which is fine, but that doesn't allow sometimes these kind of bridges between cultures. So the question is how you build these connections between meanings, right? And it's when I talk about a little bit about silence and vibration, I think that at this point of history, that's very important. Otherwise, you just get stuck in this kind of, you get lost in translation. Yeah.
Well, I beg to disagree. Because I actually think one of the things that I found interesting in your talk was the space of translation. What happens in those spaces? I think those are very productive spaces. So wanting to create a notion or a word or within your own sphere, whatever that can be, can, in my opinion, only be a productive act. Then there is a process of negotiation that happens, which is that thing called translation, within what other people have created. you know. And I think that is very important. Instead of being bought into other notions out there, you know. So I think that while you're cognizant of the other notions and the other words and so on and so forth, it is important to find your own words and then find those spaces of negotiation. Because, again, it's a matter of relation in the world, it's a matter of respect, it's a matter of situation, you know, situating yourself, you know, and there is something about situating within language spaces, within a language, you know. So I think, you know, like you, but or unlike, I actually grew up with Ngemba, which is my mother tongue, you know, which wasn't spoken in school. We were not supposed to speak that in school, but at home we had to speak that, you know. And I think it's important. It's important in understanding a space, and, you know, and I come back to a people because I come from a people. There is a lineage. There is a people. There is a people. And I think that is important. I know my grandmother. I know my grandmother's grandmother. You know, and I think that language also helps me in situating within this history. You know, I don't think we should water down everything and just say, okay, you know, we just under one umbrella. And I think we have to find different notions and find ways of translating between them.
Yeah, I think that maybe we don't disagree that much, but the thing that I have with, of course, I'm not like saying that we should just kind of like leave aside the specific local indigenous languages. Not at all, quite the contrary. The problem that I have sometimes with this specificity of epistemology related to language is that it's very difficult to avoid exoticism when you approach to that. That's kind of the tricky part, because it always sounds good, you know, like, yeah, I speak like this. So, you know, how to avoid exoticism when you're being that specific at this point of history? That's my question. I really don't know how exactly. Yeah.
But, you know, exoticism is always in the eye of the beholder.
Well, that is the reason I mentioned the word rigor. It is a discipline, I think, to work with language. If I might add,
Sure.
just in terms of possibilities for museums, queering it, for example. I don't know whether you find this, you might find this romantic, but it actually did happen, but I don't know what happened afterwards. This was the Museum of Contemporary Art in Sydney a long time ago, about 20 years ago, where they entered into a treaty, the word was a treaty, with an Aboriginal society, Papunya. And the treaty involved the museum doing all things museums do well, interpretation, conservation, documentation, exhibitions, travel, etc. But the ownership does not pass to the museum. So the ownership remains with Papunya, and they can pull it out anytime. So it seems to me that part of what queering might be is an inquiry into ownership. Because museums can be a center of great professional activity. And the amount of work that I can see everyone in this room capable of doing could very well be given to a group of people to whom you do not necessarily have to take the objects of.
Isn't that an interesting idea? To not have to have a museum where the ownership is actually not
Yours.
Yes, it's somebody else's. And if we don't have any more questions, I think we should at least end on that note. That it's a rather hopeful note. So considering where we actually started from, that's actually a very nice place to end. So thank you very much for your contribution. What museum is it?